I keep a running count of how many miracles the company needs to succeed. When the number gets out of control, the probability is so low that I struggle to envision that sort of Goldilocks scenario.
How do you make a speculative bet on emerging technology? We explore the high-stakes world of quantum venture capital and cover a strategic framework that evaluates everything from physical infrastructure and QPUs to middleware and end-user applications. Find out how investors can avoid red flags and maybe even spot the future Nvidia of quantum in this episode of the Post-Quantum World. I'm your host, Konstantinos Karagiannis. I lead quantum computing services at Protiviti, where we're helping companies prepare for the benefits and threats of this exploding field. I hope you'll join each episode as we explore the technology and business impacts of this post-quantum era. Our guest today is an investment director at Intel Capital. Kike Miralles, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Konstantinos. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you're a fellow New Yorker. We don't live very far apart, just separated by the East River, and we should have done this in person, but what are you going to do? Here we are. Here we are doing it this way. Yeah, thanks for joining. Every time we do the topic of investment in any way, shape, or form, I feel this crazy weight to announce to the world that this doesn't constitute investment advice, et cetera, even though we're going to be talking about nothing but investing. But this isn't really stock trading. This isn't, hey, buy IonQ tomorrow or buy whatever. This is more about your philosophy and what you guys do. And obviously, it's capital, right? So very,
That's
very
right.
different kind of conversation. Yeah. So we're just setting that stage and you can read the disclaimers in the show notes and all that stuff. So that said, with your strategy, it's kind of unique. You have a whole stack you go through, a 5-layer stack. So maybe we could dive right into some of that meat just to get people's minds waking up. Describe that 5-layer stack and what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the idea behind the stack is to try and separate a little bit the different contributions that different kinds of companies can make to the quantum computing stack.
Mm-hmm.
These machines are pretty complex. There's a lot to be built. And since we're still in the early innings of the industry, reality is that sometimes the boundaries between these layers are not super clear, but it does help to at least understand where everyone kind of is trying to play or what they're trying to win. So this we use a 5-layer stack starting at the top with the applications, so the algorithms, the things that an end user would interact with. Then middleware, which is a category that I use somewhat liberally to mean anything that is not end user facing and that potentially also interacts kind of downstream with some of the hardware pieces, but for the most part it's still a majority software layer, so like software development kits and
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things. Then you would have the interface and control layer, because something that makes quantum a little bit unique is that the computers themselves, like the QPUs themselves, are kind of passive. You need to act on them pretty actively to do computations. And so this interface with the outside world and the control are particularly important for quantum. And so we've chosen to separate it in the stack. Then you have the actual quantum hardware, which will include the QPUs as well as other things like the scale out infrastructure, like interconnects. And then lastly, you would have like the infrastructure layer, more these sort of non-quantum but essential hardware like shielding, vacuum, cryo, etc.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. It first caught my eye when I saw about your stack because quantum is a stack, right? That's how we determine everything we do. Can we eke out a little more performance here, eke out a little there? And you're addressing it is, well, how almost like a report card,
Mhm.
because you're reporting on how everyone's doing and then helping decide on what's worth the investment or worthwhile in the field, right?
Yeah.
With each of these. Before we continue with more of the 5 steps, let's just zoom back out for a second and maybe you could just give us a quick description of what Intel Capital is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we are the Intel venture arm. Our goal is ultimately to support early stage startups that are trying to shape the future of computing technology, whatever that means: AI, data centers, semiconductor manufacturing and equipment, things like that, and anything related to that, things like robotics and power electronics, etc. We are, I would say, Series A is our sweet spot. Series Bs as well. We can do pretty much any stage, but I would say Series A's are our bread and butter. And yeah, and I would say, we typically invest 5 to 15 million in our first check. Sorry. With Quantum, we're a little bit more flexible than usual because it's so early still in the category, and so it is possible for a Series C or D company to still have venture-like return potential. So we're a bit more flexible there when it comes to the entry point, although we are still sensitive to our kind of investment parameters around ownership, etc.
So it'd be helpful to kind of give listeners a sense of what types of investments you make in this area. So if you start with the application layer, like what are you looking for there? You're looking for how big the user base is, how easy it is to use some kind of like tool, or what are you looking for there?
Absolutely. So I think in the application layer, because the hardware itself is still so nascent,
Hmm.
it is difficult to do commercially useful stuff with what we currently have. And so one of the big questions whenever it comes to applications is, how does this business company transition from what is likely to be a pilot driven activity, very consulting, like very a lot of hand holding involved with your customers? How do you transition that towards a more venture friendly SaaS like type of model where scaling up is, it's relatively easy, versus kind of turning it into a, very heavy hand holding business model? So I would say that's probably the biggest priority in within applications, besides, the product itself.
Yeah, because even though we don't have all these cases of advantage that people are showing, right? The quantum computers aren't in production widely on the on the line, so to speak. You're kind of hedging against how easy it will be for certain companies to make that a reality soon. And we always talk about this in the industry, right? To prepare now, to build use cases and be sort of like a fast leader, and rather than a fast follower, and be ready to bring these out to the world. So, are you actively then investing in companies that are developing sort of like front end suites, things that make coding easy? Are you looking into those areas, or is it not that granular yet?
So we definitely are. I would say again, especially for things like coding SDKs and the like,
Hmm.
you end up coming back to a similar position of what's the plan to capture value. I think a general trend in quantum is that you see a lot of people drawing parallels to things like this, the emergence of the semiconductor ecosystem, saying, look at when, for example, the EDA tools that we used to design chips came online, and people are trying to, I guess, front load some of this and say, hey, I know that this has to happen at some point. I want to do it today, even if it's a little bit early,
Hmm.
because I want to make sure that when it's time for this thing to explode, I will be best positioned to capture all of the value. Now, the challenge is, of course, there's very little difference between being too early and being wrong. And I think that's the biggest decision point for us when it comes to these kinds of products. So like both applications and middleware, you're always looking for that sort of, how early are you, and will you be able to still be around when the inflection point happens and your product has that sort of, scale up moment.
Yeah, and one thing I want everyone to know is you're not just like a finance bro. You actually have a background in physics, so I wanted to point that out. Um, yeah, just in case they're like, "Who is this guy talking?" He's just like pushing, Yeah, no, he's actually got a background in physics. So, how do you find that helps you? Because as we move down the stack, we're starting to get towards middleware control, and you invested in quantum machines, right? That company.
Mhm.
So, when you tell me a little bit about that layer, I just want to get a sense of how did your background in physics sort of like influence how you made those decisions.
Absolutely. So it's clearly helpful because
Hmm.
it really allows you to have a direct conversation with the founders, especially with technical founders, and really engage with them. Sometimes it can be a bit of a detractor, like, one of these things where if you know a little bit too much, you become permanently pessimistic about things because you know all of the ways in which something could go wrong.
Hmm.
And so you have to go a little bit more out of your way to keep that sort of optimistic what if mentality that you more typically bring to areas where you may be less intimately familiar with and where you're more willing to be like, sure, that's a risk, but what if they figured it out? And so I would say the best, at least for me, the most enjoyable piece, like ultimately I can never be as technical as any of these founders, but it really adds value to be able to have a deep technical conversation and for a founder to know that if things go sideways, if things take a little bit longer, if they want to change the strategy for whatever reason, like maybe a new development changes what's optimal, I think it's good to have an investor at the table who understands why that's happening. And it's not like it's there to make that decision jointly with you or to advise you if that's what you need, versus just having someone that, you know, doesn't really have the context to add that much to that side of the conversation.
So it sounds like, I mean, not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you might have certain, I don't know, warning signs, like things that you look for based on your preconceived notions of what technologies might take a very long time to develop or what things might never develop. Do you have any sort of like red flags? Do you have like a go-to list of red flags that you look for in general when you're deciding on whether to invest in a company at any layer of the stack, really?
So I think in my mind, there's one thing that I always do, which is I keep a running count of how many miracles, so to speak, the company needs to succeed.
Okay.
And when the number gets out of control, then it gets to a point where you're like the compound probability of all of this stuff happening is so low that I do struggle to envision that sort of Goldilocks moment or scenario where you're like, ah, everything happened, this is great, and we're going to the moon. So I do try to understand what are the underlying bets or the underlying conditions for these companies to succeed. And I mean, you probably are not surprised to hear me say this, but I do not like it when there's like 10 of those.
Yeah. So you've created something like a Drake equation of your own, where instead of
Yeah,
looking for alien life, you're looking for like you multiply all these things out, and the probability goes down greatly to finding instead of little green men, little coherent qubits that can like do something in the world.
yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty funny actually. You got me thinking that way when you said Goldilocks. So that's valid. Coming up with a list of 10 things that would have to go right. That's kind of scary, and at times the industry does feel that way. That said, have you seen anything last year that surprised you in such a way that you're like thinking, "Whoa, we might actually be in better shape with some of these potential investments"?
I think so. So, sometimes you read the resource estimations for some of the use cases that, that we hope to tackle with quantum. And it feels a little bit depressing because you're like, clearly we are orders of magnitude away, especially in things like circuit depth from where we need to be. But at the same time, I feel like you're applying a little bit of linear thinking when you do that. So you kind of expect everything to move in the same way that it has. Like this sort of, it took us 10 years to go from 2 to 50. So then if we need to get to a trillion, then it's never going to happen. And you're like, well, no, it's usually not like that. And I would say the transition to everyone talking about logical qubits, encodings, and how we're really doing better with regard to errors, I think has been one of the fastest evolutions that I've seen in general. Like I feel like in 2023, this was still, everyone was still talking about what we were going to be able to do with the noisy machines as they were. And some voices were already saying, I don't think that's going to happen. But then in 2025, like very quickly, everyone was like, clearly these noisy machines are not going to be that commercially useful. They're a stepping stone, a useful stepping stone. And this is how we go towards logical. This is how we do better with with these magic states. This is how we do better with distillation.
Mhm.
And I think that was a surprise for me that we saw the commercial industry shift gears so quickly.
Yeah, it's funny how some of the core things that have driven this industry all of a sudden started to manifest. Last year we
Mm.
started to hear about logical qubits, which are of course connected to error correction, which is of course connected to all the way back in the beginning with Shor. He was talking
Mhm.
about both cracking encryption and the need for logical qubits and error correction and everything. And then we also saw lots of evolutions of Shor last year too, Shor's algorithm. So without giving away rather anything, is there something that you're allowed to say about what you expect from an investment like quantum machines, just so we can get a sense of what you're like thinking and what you hope to see?
So, look, I think there's two things that matter. One is quantum machines has proven that, I mean, they're already working with most of the quantum computing companies out there that can work with their systems. They have a viable business that they've already established. Like there's, I think it's pretty unique to be able to say that about a company working on the quantum ecosystem. And so, I'd be lying if I said I expect anything short of great things from them. I think I'm very excited to see the next generation product. Like one of the things when you think about scaling up these solid state platforms, cables is one of the first things that everyone talks about. And so I'm really excited to see the next generation of these products and how they work on the thermal issues, the noise issues, the sheer amount of cabling, and how we figure out the path to hundreds of thousands of solid state qubits. And for sure, I'd say would be very excited to see the this team deliver on a vision that, I mean, we're still so early, and it's like there's so much more that you can do still on this stuff that I would be really really excited to see them become the default control provider for the entire quantum industry, because I think that's where they could go.
Yeah, and your answer kind of took us down the whole stack. I mean, we got all the way down to basically the wiring bottleneck, right? That's
Mhm.
what we're talking about here. Whenever people who don't know anything about the industry see a quantum computer with the dilution fridge and everything, they're like, "What are those coils and things?" Yeah, it's like it does get a little unwieldy. So we could zoom out for a second here, and I'd like to ask you, what do you think? What would you like to see when it comes to this shift of connecting multiple QPUs together? What kinds of investments are you looking for in the space? Are you looking for like standalone companies that would enable that, or are you just interested in investing in the companies that seem to have internalized that in house and made it like part of their goal? Like IonQ, they of course absorbed a bunch of technology to be able to do that.
Mhm. So I would say both.
Mhm.
I think it depends on what a company considers their core kind of competence, and that depends on their specific QPU architecture and how they're thinking about doing this interconnection. And I promise this is not a cop out. So ultimately, when I think about interconnection, I think about it in two ways. One is a default could be to do it optically, which works natively with ions and with neutral atoms, different frequencies, but still kind of native. If you move towards solid state, for the most part, that means that you need a transaction from the microwave frequencies up to optical and then back
Mhm.
to microwave once you get to the other side. And the challenge is that the transaction step is extremely low quality. And there are players working on, on solving that, players like QFox and others. But the reality is that we're not yet there when it comes to that. So I would expect, for example, to see the atomic platforms show the value of these interconnects before the solid state ones do. And to their credit, and this is coming back to the point on what makes your architecture unique. There's a company called Photonic that makes silicon spin qubits, but they connect them optically, and their whole thing
Mhm.
is being able to do that. So that's why I said that it really depends on what you consider your core competency to be.
And are you getting any really wild approaches that you weren't expecting? Are there companies coming out of the woodwork that you're like, I can't believe they even thought to try such a thing? Like mixing together modalities or anything like that? Are they trying to accelerate that? Just things that are surprising you about companies coming out of the woodwork. And by the way, I just want to pause your answer and say I do firmly expect you to be getting a lot of weird calls after this episode posts. Companies are like, "Oh, he's interested. Cool, I'm in." So I apologize in advance for that, but I'd like to know what are like some of those more out there approaches that you're looking at.
So I would say like what really surprised me is that ultimately you can make a qubit out of anything that can be turned into a two-level system,
Hmm.
which in quantum is a lot of stuff. It's as some physicists like to joke, is harmonic oscillators all the way down. And the challenge there is how believable is it that a completely new platform and new system will be able to catch up to what has taken the others years and decades to show. And I think the burden of proof there is extremely high because it's taken both. It's not even just time, but it's also a lot of manpower. It's also a lot of capital. And so I'm generally skeptical when someone comes and says, hey, there's this fancy weird system that you can turn into a qubit and we're going to scale it to 1 million qubits in 2 years. And you're like, I don't think so.
Hmm.
That definitely, that's the point where when my inner physicist comes out and starts asking a bunch of questions to understand like how legit this is. Honestly, I would say probably Microsoft's approach is the most out there with these Majorana qubits, probably the most out there in the, I guess, mainstream. But I've certainly gotten LinkedIn requests with pretty weird stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I get people sending me papers and things to read. Like, look, I just need $10,000 to get this going, and I'm not a capital investor, and I don't want to be, so I don't want any more of those emails. But at the same time, you're like, oh, what if I just like trashed an idea without looking into it and it's not real? I don't know. One day you could end up kicking yourself. But I agree that for something that major, it's unlikely that someone on the back of a napkin came out with room temperature quantum computing modality that will be at scale within a year or two. That is kind of crazy to imagine. Just how with patents you have to have working models for, I believe, cold
Yeah.
fusion and perpetual motion machines, thankfully, because everyone thinks they have one. I, I wouldn't be surprised if pretty soon it's like, oh, logical qubit, you have to have a working prototype, something like that. I could see that happening. So when you're looking for companies that do have their ducks in a row, and these are modalities that are sort of tried and true, and they just want to promise something else, what do you look for there? Like if they're saying that, oh, we're just going to do another Joseph's injunction, but we're planning on getting to 10,000 qubits logical by next year by doing this. So do you get that kind of thing, and is there a different approach that you take then? Because it's not that the idea isn't sound, it's just their engineering challenges that you have to weigh at that time, right?
Exactly. Then I think I think there's two questions that really matter. Like we are, on the one hand, we're still very early in the industry, but on the other hand, we already have a bunch of well-funded and well-capitalized players. And so a question that I always have for new entrants is, why will you be able to capitalize yourself in a way that will really allow you to compete with what's out there? Because it doesn't even, honestly, to a certain extent, it doesn't even matter if your system is that good if every investor that could give you 100 million is already conflicted out of potentially giving you that 100 million. And there's less and less investors that can give you money the more you need and the later stage you go. And we're starting to be in that sort of awkward phase where most of the original players are still around. We haven't gotten, I mean, we have gotten a few exits, but it's not like we've gotten 15 massive exits. And so for the new entrants, the question I think is ultimately, where are you going? Like, how are you going to monetize this system? Like, is the goal to go all the way? Are you thinking more, hey, we would be the perfect acquisition target for some of the later stage companies? If you think you can go all the way, why is that? And then actually going towards the technology and really understanding like what's the differentiation of your approach and your system, and why is that something that it makes sense that a standalone company tries to achieve. And for example, with solid state qubits, I would say, take Colab, for example. So it's a superconducting qubit company started by Alan Ho, who comes from the Google team, and John Martinez, the most recent physics Nobel Prize winner, who was also at Google for a time. And their central thesis was, if we don't fix the manufacturing, we're never going to scale these systems. And I think that is a completely different take versus what most of the industry has been saying in terms of we can just scale what we have. I mean, sure, we have to figure out manufacturing, but it's not that important. Others, for example, like Alice and Bob, have taken the we don't think the transmon system, which is the most typical superconducting qubit, will work. We think CAD qubits are a better way of doing this. And so
Hmm.
I typically try to go there like, why do you think whatever everyone else is doing doesn't make sense? Why does your thing make sense? And why is this fundable?
So it sounds like there might be another factor at play here. This idea of like revenue realism, too. With going all the way, right? Right now, because you mentioned the way the landscape is shaking out. What does real revenue look like? There are companies that are relying heavily on quantum grants, from the government, that kind of thing. And what does quality look like then in the 2026 market? Is there some kind of expectation of actual money appearing, or is it just going to be this constant eternal stage of eventually?
I would probably have to go with the latter, at least for now. So
Hmm.
we see sometimes, I mean, we tend not to love government related revenue
Hmm.
because it feels less sticky, less high quality, less predictable. You're more at risk of funding changes and things of that sort. But at the same time, I mean, to their credit, the governments are many times the ones that are willing to invest significant money in getting these things off the ground. And so I struggle to imagine, at least for the QPU players, significant at scale commercial revenue anytime soon that is really based on a quantum computing business. I think quantum sensing, for example, is a different line of business that could create revenue shorter term. I think that's the path that Cold Quanta, so Inflection, followed. But when it comes to revenue for a QPU company, I think we're still looking for the most part to government one way or the other. And if it's not the government, it's probably the government one step removed.
So you guys invest in more than just quantum. You do other
Mhm.
things, of course, other bleeding. So do you view those as more short-term investments that'll pay off, and then quantum is like more of a long game? Is that how you balance it out? Is some other type of semiconductor or robotics or something just something you view as cashing in on quicker?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's about the duration of the investment. I would say it's more related to the sources of risk.
Hmm.
Ultimately, with quantum, you're taking much more aggressive technological risk. There's other categories where you're trying to play with different levers, like, hey, I want to take more market risk, or I want to take a more, or I want to take a technological risk, but more focused on will this be the winning kind of solution to a given problem? Versus here, it's a bit broader. I would also say you could have made the same sort of question in like 2016, for example, in terms of, hey, if you're investing in IonQ, are you investing thinking of a 20 or 25-year timeline? And then, of course, they SPACed 5 years later.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that I do have in mind is I don't think that when you do venture investment in quantum, you're necessarily underwriting the complete trajectory to commercial, full scale quantum computing necessarily. Like you may be underwriting a technological arc, and that should be good enough to create, I think, several multi-billion-dollar exits because one, the potential of these technologies is significantly larger, and two, that's kind of the role of private markets to a certain extent, at least when it comes to deep tech. I think, for example, nuclear fusion is a bit of a similar position that I don't think you're necessarily underwriting a company will have 10 power plants by the time they go public. You're probably underwriting they did it, like there's net energy. This is viable. We can go and build a power plant now. And I think of quantum in a bit of a similar manner.
So if we were looking ahead a whole year into 2027, what one major technical bottleneck across all of your five-layer stack would you be most interested in investing in if it looked legit? Like what thing would probably move the needle enough that you'd be super excited that you scored that company?
I would say anything that has a credible. I'll focus for a sec in QPUs, and then we
Sure.
can take
Hmm.
a step back to the other layers. I'd say within QPUs, it's all about scaling. Like someone who shows up and says, "Hey, I have a path to compressing the timeline to scale to 100,000 qubits or to a million qubits significantly." I mean, it would be a clear, well, I don't know if a clear investment, it would depend on a bunch of things, but an extremely high quality signal that there's something good there. Scaling, to my opinion, remains the biggest challenge together with circuit depth.
Hmm.
The challenge with circuit depth is just that it's much more related to the operation of the system. And so in my mind, you're always like, well, you may figure it out, but then you may be stuck at 1,000. So maybe it's not that useful that you figure it out. So I would say scaling remains the number one thing that I worry about. And in other layers, I think or in other areas of quantum, I would say, for example, I mean, if someone came and said, "Hey, Giga, there's an extremely high quality transaction thing that allows you can network whatever you want optically and with microwaves, and it works." I mean, maybe not as well as if it was on a single chip, but pretty close. I mean, you get my money.
That's funny. Do you look for any kind of like Nvidia effect? Like with AI, for example, you could have, in the early days of AI, you could have tried to invest in groups working on actual neural networks, or you could have said, "Hey, they might need a certain type of hardware, invested in Nvidia, and become a trillionaire." There's like ways to look at. Is there some kind of really out there technology that you view as so necessary for the quantum industry that you invest in it anyway, even though it's not called quantum in any way, shape, or form?
Hmm. Mm, trying to think. So quantum, I expect it to be a fully hybrid modality from day one. Like for the most part, this is going to be classical computers with the QPUs coming in where it really matters.
Hmm.
And so right now, it's so focused on what can these QPUs do that I don't know what that other sort of technology would be. I would say, for example, if you could, we're probably here talking about potentially violating thermodynamics, but if depends on how you do it. But if you could, for example, get rid of all of the thermal load of controlling and interacting with the qubits in a dilution refrigerator, that'd be pretty awesome.
Yeah. But if someone, I mean, again, I'm not a capital investor, but if someone came up to me and said that they were violating the law of thermodynamics, that would probably be the end of the meeting for me. I'd be like, "Nice to see you." I don't know if I'd be on board, but sure, that makes sense. So, quantum, of course, impacts a lot of areas, and one that comes up a lot and is near and dear to my heart is also security. Do you have any plans to invest in any aspects of security, whether it's securing communications with things more like QKD or whatever, or actually post quantum cryptography, like any of that side? Do you have anything in that area?
So we look at both areas. We also have a team within Intel Capital that's quite active within cyber.
Hmm.
I would say right now we've taken more of a kind of wait and see approach, and the reason for that is I'm not fully sold on QKD right now. I assume that this means that Europe and China are very angry listening to what I just said, since they're funding it much more aggressively than the US is. But it's one of these situations where the biggest disadvantage to the post quantum cryptography piece is that it's unclear if it's as good as the classical cryptography stuff that we already have. It's based on the math being hard. We just haven't had enough time to have sufficient brain power applied to breaking these post quantum cryptography algorithms. But at the same time, WhatsApp, iMessage, Signal, like all of this stuff is already beginning to be, well, implementing post quantum cryptography. And so, to a certain extent, that leaves QKD in a rather awkward position, which is you're protecting against an unclear threat that it's unclear when it will come. It would likely still be vulnerable to other kinds of attacks. So you would likely still have to do like sort of a dual track system where you're doing both QKD and post quantum cryptography on the classical channel. And so I'm not super convinced that it's as urgent and as big as right now. You could argue that there are some industries that do have data that would be more amenable to this sort of steal now, decrypt later type of attack. But at the same time, is it, again, big and urgent enough to create multi-billion-dollar venture outcomes? I don't know. And I think that's the biggest question for me in the communication space. Like, what is it exactly that we're trying to solve, and why is that a commercially large problem in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, we know QKD can't work everywhere, obviously. We know that. That's I just viewed as one extra potential layer, but I'm more concerned
Mhm.
with implementing the new cryptographic standards that work
Yeah,
traditionally, like something that will go end to end from your cell phone to
exactly.
whatever server, in the distance. So, yeah, I just didn't know if companies were coming to you with ideas for making the move to post-quantum cryptography easier, and if that became a compelling investment, company that had that kind of plan.
We would definitely look at it for sure.
Okay. And the number of emails you're going to get just went up again. No, I'm just kidding. So I guess I'll try and get your forward-thinking hat for one last question before we wind down. Is there some kind of killer app that you're in the back of your mind thinking? So we talked about the stack and getting qubits to be logical, all that good stuff. But is there something that you really hope someone would say, well, we're doing this because we want to enable, and then whatever that killer, maybe finance, pharma, whatever it is, like what's that killer app that if you heard that that's part of their plan, you'd be like, oh yeah, this is going to make major revenue in a couple of years.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I wouldn't leave you with an easy one.
So, so I think I'm gonna skip the cryptography focused one because it's the weird thing about cryptography where the application spawns an entire industry just because you just enabled a new way of attacking something.
Mhm.
I would be interested in seeing kind of this promise of materials, pharma, and like this more, not just optimization, but like really this sort of simulation capabilities appear.
Mhm.
Clearly those are going to be the first ones to come. And I think especially within pharma, it's one of these areas where the stakes are potentially large enough that you could see a relatively rapid uptake of any new capabilities that come. And I think I would be pretty interested in seeing how that industry is going to merge, let's say, the relatively recent, relatively recent AI-driven capabilities with the quantum-driven capabilities, because ultimately, you're hoping to marry the bottoms up. I have the physics sort of calculation with the top down. We can predict things based on patterns in the data, and I'd be really curious to see how that creates value in pharma and related industries. I do think that's probably one of the most rapid uptakers of quantum if that comes to fruition.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it's an area where I'm pretty sure you could create a loop between quantum for AI and AI for quantum. You're like creating better trading data, you're saving time in the lab, and then now all of a sudden we could refine it again with the loop all over again. So I think that's a strong one. And of course, it goes back to how quantum computers were invented in theory. Feynman's idea of simulating the universe, that definitely applies to things that
Mhm.
exist in the universe, like pharma. It's a real thing in the universe. So yeah, I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing some of this with us. And do you have any hot stock tips before you leave? No, I'm just kidding. But thanks for coming on.
It's not investment advice, but here's 5 stocks that you need to buy.
Yeah, exactly. People are waiting now, and then they're going to hear the end credits, and they're going to be so disappointed. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
That does it for this episode. Thanks to Kike Miralles for joining to discuss Intel Capital. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to Protivity's The Post-Quantum World and maybe leave a review to help others find us. Be sure to follow me on all socials at Constant Hacker. That's Constant with a K, Hacker. You'll find links there to what we're doing in quantum computing services at Protiviti. You can also DM me questions or suggestions for what you'd like to hear on the show. For more information on our quantum services, check out Protiviti.com or follow Protiviti Tech on X and LinkedIn. Until next time, be kind and stay quantum curious.